So yeah, my presentation is called 50 Shades Config. I'm just going to give you a bit of an introduction into, well, not an introduction, just a flyby on configuration and a few design decisions, things like that. So I thought I'd do my introduction via images. So on the left-hand side, I'm co-founder of Lab51. So we specialize in producing test solutions, not necessarily just using NI, but NI is a big part of what we do. We're a systems integration partner. I'm a LabVIEW champion and a LabVIEW architect, and also run the Midlands LabVIEW user group. And we also talked about GDevCon as well, so big part of that too. In my spare time, I help out at Code Club, so teaching junior school kids how to code games, which is good fun, and it's surprising how quickly they pick stuff up. So that's a big part of what I do. I also, top right, was trying to represent like big engineering, because I really love like the idea of understanding how stuff works, and I love like the big scale of that. So that was my effort at trying to represent that, but I don't know whether I've done a very good job of that. And I also love rugby, so I play for Harvey Rugby Club, and I also coach my eldest lad there as well. So that's just a little bit about me. So to give you a little bit of background as to sort of why I came up with this subject, recently had to develop an application from scratch, and shock, there was a need for configuration, which is probably pretty common to all of you guys as well. And I needed to work out how I was going to do it. And in the sort of previous 6 months, I'd sort of seen through various applications we'd had to get involved in, different ways of doing it. So I had to sort of use a bit of that experience to sort of understand whether I'd go down that route or kind of use the way that I knew well and was confident with. So ultimately, I did end up choosing the way I was confident with, the one I was confident with, and that kind of made me think, well, there must be other stuff, obviously other ways of doing it, and this presentation was an opportunity to try and understand that a little bit better, and hopefully share that with you guys and get your input to it as well, and see whether we can sort of make some improvements for ourselves, as well as me sort of understanding a little bit more about how other people do it as well. And there was kind of a thing in the end at the back of my mind was about trying to work out whether this is a good opportunity to use to develop a reuse library. It's something we've considered before, but not quite worked out the best way to do it. So that's gone in the back of my mind. So what I'm going to start off with is go through a little bit of the whys and the whats of config, and then sort of dive into a few of the different formats there are, benefits, all that kind of jazz, and then talk a little bit about some of the design decisions that you might need to think about when doing the configuration for applications. And I actually learned a load of stuff doing this, which was pretty cool. So hopefully I'll share that with you guys, and maybe you'll learn some stuff as well. And then we'll finish up with a code review, which will be exciting. So why do we worry about config? I'm pretty sure everyone in the room, everyone online probably said these words, you know, we'll just code that, we'll just hard code that for now. And then that turns out to be the way that it stays. It doesn't get changed from being hard coded. And then you get that request from somebody to say, oh, can you just have a look at it? We need to change this from this to this. And then it comes back to the fact that you hard coded it, and then you've got to go into the code and change it rather than changing it through a configuration file. I've definitely got a story from when I was starting out, and we were developing a really simple sort of data acquisition and control application. And we had one of the devices that was talking serial. So we needed to obviously put in a COM port for that. And I thought, yeah, I'll hard code that. It's never going to change. And lo and behold, it did. So had to go around the loop of changing that in the code. Actually, we ended up making it a configurable parameter when we came around to it second time. But obviously that took time, cost money, all that kind of stuff. So it's really what I'm trying to get at with config. Why it matters is because it enables you to have all those things that might possibly change in a place where you can change them without having to change your code. So that's what we talk about in terms of decoupling those settings from your sort of hardware or your software logic, and ultimately it gives you those benefits that are listed in the bottom there. But it's a balance, right? So you can configure everything, you can configure nothing, you can do something in between. You need to find that balance that suits the application that you're developing. And in terms of the what, so whilst I'm sort of talking through this, if you guys ever think about the sorts of things that you've had to configure, and whether there's sort of some funky stuff and really interesting stuff that you've had to configure, maybe you can share those with us in a sec once I've covered these little bits. But there's some obvious ones on there. and path is an obvious one. It means that your application is maintainable. It's not unrealistic that a sort of location of a file or a folder is going to change across the lifetime of an application, especially in aerospace, where you're sort of talking 20+ years that you need this software to be operational. So it's probably one of the things that's top of the list when you're looking at things to configure. UI preferences is another really good one for flexibility. So one of the examples that you might sort of apply to this is giving people access to certain features. You can be able to toggle those things on and off, but also maybe even switching things in and out depending on whether the type of user that's logged in. So a common one that we come across is that manual control of some sort of device. So giving that to a certain sort of engineer type, user type, rather than to everyday operator of the machine. Another good one for maintainability is your test limits and sort of calibration data. So this is really good to help the software evolve with the product that you're testing and also with the equipment you're testing, using, sorry. And instead of having to change those within a hard-coded environment, you can use your configuration files to update those. I think there's definitely some caveats to this and some things you need to think about when you're doing that, but in general, they're good things to be keeping out of the application or out of your code at least. And the other one about sort of, this isn't necessarily feature toggle, but you talk about sort of simulated hardware. So when you're sat at your desk and you haven't got the hardware in front of you, having the ability to switch things off into simulation mode so you can carry on your development. And then when you get down to working with the actual hardware, you can turn that onto hardware and start configuring with it. So that's a really good way of using configuration. But in essence, is anything that you think might change in the future that you don't want to have to then worry about changing the code. So anybody got anything that they've configured that's like a little bit wild, a little bit unusual? Nothing. I couldn't think of any examples either because it's all pretty standard stuff, I think. But not to worry. So what we'll jump into next is sort of all the different sort of file formats that you can use for configuration. So I'm going to go through a few of these in a bit of detail. So I'm not going to go through this this page necessarily, but just as a bit of a show of hands, like, yeah, who's used or using INI? It's relatively popular. Most people in the room using that. JSON for configuration data is similar, so maybe slightly less. And XML. One or two. Okay, so going kind of in order there. So most popular in the room is INI. I don't know if I'm going to bother asking about text file and Excel. Is anyone using those two? I mean, they're on my list of like for hate. I wouldn't want to try and work with configuration files in those formats, but we'll cover that perhaps in a little bit. CSV, yeah. It's got a little bit more structure, I guess, than a text file, but yeah, doesn't necessarily have some of the downfalls of Excel. Okay, so like I said, I used INI in that application I referred to at the start, and the main reasons I really like INI and sort of one of the couple of the pros is its simplicity. It's readable within Notepad. When you're in Notepad, it's quite nice to be able to see your sections, see your keys. You can quite easily navigate that. So I feel like the readability is one of the reasons why I like it. If you get a really big file, then you might have a challenge scrolling through all that, but I think that's relatively common across all the formats of file. But we'll have a look in a bit at one of them that I think starts to solve that problem. It's well used. Obviously, all of us are using it in the room here, and it's kind of it's well used across test engineering as well as the general industry. And also from a simplicity perspective, the LabVIEW built-in native functions are also dead simple. So I just took a little snip of the code that we're going to have a look at in a bit. So you'll see on here on the left-hand side, we're just opening a file reference, and then in the middle, I'm just using that reference to read a section and a key within the section, and then pulling all the data out through there. So dead simple from that perspective. Is there anything else you think I missed? Those people are using INI. Any pros or cons of INI that you guys have come up against to use that approach? That covered it. So next up is JSON. So probably I don't know whether it's more readable or not than the INI, but you get nesting, so it kind of groups it slightly differently, which I don't know whether that improves the readability or not. It's probably personal preference. But what I found from using it and opening it in Visual Studio Code is that it gives you the IntelliSense. So in VS Code, it gives you IntelliSense, so it tells you whether you've messed up and you've kind of taken a bracket out where you shouldn't have, or put a comma in where you shouldn't have. So that's one of the real benefits of being able to using JSON in VS Code anyway. Obviously, it's very popular within software development. So if you're sort of integrating your application, your LabVIEW application to web integrations or any APIs, then there's potential benefit there. You've obviously got the ability to check the file against the schema. So if you've got a particular way that it's been structured, you can check that against the schema. And then if we come to the kind of LabVIEW side of it, there's lots of different toolkits that you can use to access it. JSON text is the one I've picked out here, and I'll just jump into a bit of code now. But one of the downsides of JSON, which I think we sort of touched on a little bit earlier, is it's sort of not strongly typed. So you've got 5 different types of data. And one of the challenges, I think, is when you have a Boolean parameter, that parameter will come up as the value of that parameter would come up as true, the word true. So you've just got to manage the sort of passing of that within your process for reading the data in. But I think you're probably going to have similar things across all of the different file types. That's not necessarily a JSON thing, but something to be aware of. And I could pull that out because it was quite an obvious one. Yeah, so the JSON text stuff. So here's a bit of an example that I've sort of put together as part of this. So on the right hand side is my configuration file in JSON format. What I quite liked as well is you've got it all color coded, so it kind of shows you where your sections are, where your arrays are, and things like that. So I found that really nice in terms of being able to visualize that and look at it. So the JSON text functions, as it's kind of a nested structure that I've got over there, you've obviously got to go down your nest levels to get to the bits of data that you want. So it takes a little, and this is obviously just chucking it together. This isn't anything in a particular format, so you've probably tidied this up into something a bit more sensible, but just showing you the idea that you're sort of walking through the objects and then pulling your data out of an array, and you've got to grab the objects within that array and grab the data out of the array within that object. So so this is an array, and then I've got another array inside there which has been pulled out down the bottom here. So to get to that point, that's the kind of steps that need to be taken to get to there. But with the LabVIEW function, that block in the middle looks a bit random. That's sort of unflattened from string. So basically, you put your JSON string data in, you give it a type def or a cluster as default, and then it converts your text data into that type def or that cluster. Which I didn't actually test this bit, but I did use something very similar for INI, and we'll sort of dig into that a little bit later on. So yeah, that's a little bit about JSON. Oh yeah, I've got just a slide just to show you the data coming out of there. So you can see that the all the items in that top big array, and then as I've pulled them out, you can see the different bits of data coming through. So I guess, yeah, this is what I'm talking about in terms of the Boolean. So obviously in LabVIEW, you won't know what that is. That's got to be converted to your actual true false Boolean to be able to be used. So yeah, next one is XML. So again, very, very popular within the software development world, and very good for sort of nested configurations. And what I liked about the readability of this one is you can open it up in a web browser and you can collapse your nest, so you haven't got to view the whole file and scroll through it. You can sort of collapse your bits down and have a look at them a little bit more easily. Again, like I say, widely used in industry, and you can use validation on this one as well. And then you've got some really good functions within LabVIEW that are native to be able to access the data as well. So there are other ways of doing it, but then it starts talking about like .NET components and external libraries and all this kind of jazz, and I'd sort of turn off a little bit of that, and because it doesn't sound too simple, so I kind of put that to one side. But I've took an example out of the LabVIEW examples just to sort of show how it might work, and it's very similar to the JSON approach. So you've got to obviously navigate down through your sort of different nests. I don't know whether they're called nests, but I've started calling them nests. The levels, and then you get to the data that you want. So it kind of shows you how that might look based on this configuration file that's overlaid. And again, you've got a similar function with XML where you can just say, this is my type def that's relative to the data, and it will convert it into your type def. Again, I did test that and try that because I didn't have time, but yeah, in principle that does that nicely, like I do when I did for my INI files. So yeah, that's XML. And then the rest of kind of groups into the wildcard section. And I think what I'd also chuck in here actually is database. I don't know if anybody uses databases for configuration. Anybody? Think.
Database, but we do use a kind of unrestricted storage.
Okay.
And we keep on memory access medium on database that way.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah. Okay. I guess with your typical database SQL type things, the structure obviously is great for all of your relational data, and connecting things up is brilliant, but I don't think it's quite suitable for configuration strictly, but I may be wrong about that. Yeah, so there are a couple that we're going to talk about. So text files, not so good. They're great for log files, right? You can chuck whatever you want in there, and you can analyze the data at the end and all that kind of stuff. I think it's good for quick and dirty kind of stuff like that. But obviously there's no structure to it. The content of the data's got no structure. I think you'd spend quite a lot of time in your passing your data from a text file into your whatever you're going to be using within your code. So I'd say that text files probably aren't a good way. There are other options that are way better. And then Excel. I think I've been scarred by Excel, to be honest. I had a bit of a bad experience with it, but it's the whole needing to sort of have where all the cells you've got to pick out and things like that. But I think the biggest thing is that you need Excel to access the ActiveX functions to interact with an X file. You need Excel on that machine to be able to do that. So that's a bit of a limiting factor potentially within some environments. So yeah, those are the ones. Anybody got any other formats that you think I've missed? Anyone got any horror stories about these two bad boys? No? No, because that's very popular in like CI. I know we've come across that in CI, but never used it in sort of application or LabVIEW development.
Never use it as well.
No.
It's good for people personally code it, so it's good for like the readability and so.
Yeah.
I think there's very much like that fade out there.
Yeah, I think you probably pick that with all these options, right? There's things that you're like, oh, brilliant, but this is a bit rubbish.
Well, I think with structure touch DSP, obviously we've got that in our architecture and part of it went through.
Sure.
We have found simple things to fix stuff, but when we move the routes to other geographies,
yeah,
then that actually the licensing of Excel, it's like a really simple thing.
Yeah.
And it's like quarter lots of trouble.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's and that's one of the things you touched on, that need to have that in the environment.
Yeah.
But it's really easy for us to migrate
from that. Yeah.
Things like these text files that use sometimes in configuration to like users and passwords.
Yeah.
They're easily altered.
Yeah. That's got to be a factor. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I'll just have a quick check on the chat because I'm not sure whether they've got an eye on that or not. I've got some good things in here. So, I see people. Yeah, Malcolm makes a good point. We'll cover that later on about validation. But lots of people on the INI bandwagon, which is interesting. So yeah, that's all the different formats. So we'll do a quick showdown because I think this is quite an interesting thing when I was thinking about it. Like, which one of these formats would you marry and which ones would you block forever? I think it's pretty clear who I'm blocking. But for me, I think I'd go on another date. I'd go on a second date with JSON and XML, see what they're all about. But if I was forced to make a decision now, I think I'd go down to INI, because like I've said before, I like all the simplicity about it. But is anyone marrying anything that I'm not marrying? Yeah. So I think if I was starting again, I might look at XML, just because I feel like it's I like the readability of it. I think that's quite good. But again, there's not much between those three. I don't think INI, JSON, and XML. I think they're very similar in terms of their pros and their cons.
I think for JSON, like say, with the readability of my web applications, but everything seems to be moving towards
Popular, right?
Everything seems to be web-based GUIs.
Yeah. And they're closely connected, aren't they? Yeah. Way to go.
That's the way forward.
Yeah.
JSON has got quite a good balance between what you need, the flexibility maybe with XML, but also we can get the base.
Yeah.
And the ability of simplicity.
Yeah. Oh, we've got Louise is on XML. Interesting. Louise, if you've got any other comments, drop them in and we'll read them out in a bit. Like any experience of that. Malcolm's marrying CSV, which I didn't cover, but it's kind of XL-y. Okay, that's good. So yeah, guys, drop some more comments in there. I'll come back to them definitely. Okay, so I'm going to change gears a little bit now. So talking about all design decisions when we're coming to building up your sort of what you're going to do for your configuration. So this one is all about kind of how you're going to manage editing. So I think there's only really two ways of doing it. You either allow people to edit the file, or you don't allow them to edit the file, and then you've got to build something into your GUI to be able to manage modifications. So I think it's probably like an application related decision, maybe, albeit it kind of in my head I'm thinking, well, don't let them change it because that's going to screw things up, right? But I think there's kind of a couple of ways that you can handle it. So if you do allow editing, and we'll talk about this later on, so I won't cover it too much in the next slide actually. If you do allow editing in the file, then you've got to have some really solid validation. So I think if you're developing a product, there's like no way you're getting away from having to have some sort of GUI interface that does your configuration management, and it has to be locked down as well, I'd imagine, because you wouldn't want users just going in and messing about with stuff. So I think in that environment, you definitely need to be thinking about the editable at runtime whilst also having it read only. But in a lot of my experience, we do one-off projects. We're not doing products. So a lot of my experience, I don't think we've a couple of instances perhaps where we've had GUI functionality to do the configuration. I think one of the reasons for that is that it costs time, it costs money to build that GUI, build all that stuff around, all the functionality around that. So ultimately someone's got to pay for it. So if I'm going to have, I'll probably put it in a quote and say, look, this is a separate bit, like you can do it if you want, but it's kind of, it's not optional. There's obviously other ways of working around it, which we'll come on to in a sec. But that's kind of my experience so far, really, is been around that taking that approach. But like I said, validation has to be done there. And I just wanted to sort of come on to one point here, which I think I used to work for Rolls-Royce, so I know a little bit about what was used to be done around stuff. And this was something that was really well done around the calibration data. So cyclic redundancy check basically allows you to check whether the data in the file has changed since it was last modified. So if you can imagine that you're doing a calibration and you save your data, what you do is you create a check number for the data in the file, and then you save that check number within the file. So then next time you open that file up, you'd run the same process to create that check number, and you're comparing those two numbers to see whether they match. If they don't match, then you've got the problem, somebody's tampered with the data in that file, so you probably don't want to use it, or you want to try and investigate what's gone on. If they match, you're all good and you can carry on. So I thought that was just a really nice way, and a really nice way that I've experienced it here, that it works really well to be able to sort of make sure you're keeping track of how things are changing within files. So that's probably quite a specific case. You wouldn't necessarily apply that to your whole configuration file. You might do, might be an approach you take, but I think there are probably got to have a really specific reason to be able to be wanting to check that type of thing. So what's everyone's thoughts on this one then? Is it get it in the GUI, or is it not bother getting the GUI?
We actually do it when we run deployments.
Okay.
So it'll reach automatically. You select the user type. It checks, pulls the data down.
Yeah.
Checks what's on the rig itself.
Yeah.
CLCs on both.
Yeah.
If they don't match.
Okay.
If they match, it will run it. If it doesn't match, it goes down.
Okay. So you've kind of got like a secure location that
Yeah.
that it's going to control,
Yeah.
and then you're comparing that to the local.
Yeah.
And then is it okay to run it if it's changed, or
If it's changed, no, it's got to.
it will just say
It will just say no, just restore everything.
get the one from
Yeah.
the secure location and go? Yeah, yeah. Which makes complete sense. Is that in production or engineering? Production. Yeah.
Yeah, our environment, our test environment, not when we're developing, that's anything.
Free staff. Yeah. Which makes sense, doesn't it? This makes sense. Yeah. Anyone else? Through the GUI or through a file editor? As you do products and stuff, do you have any need for?
We do the configuration and thing. Yeah, the issue of like permissions settings can be written, because sometimes we let them kind of paranoid customers see what, like, obviously administrators want to be able to change things.
Yeah.
They don't trust their operating.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
people have
Different levels of access.
thoughts on which ways to do that. What's the thinking about at the moment?
Yeah.
And mission space.
And is it literally like one or the other? So it's someone who's going to, a user that can edit it and a user that can't, or is it not as binary as that?
Now I think that's okay, but
Yeah.
imagine it could get complex. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Just check the chat. Okay, so Louise, thanks for your comment there. So one of the things I like about XML is the data type flexibility. INI is good for simple numbers or booleans, but if I want to have, that's a good point actually. That's a good point. So with INI, you're probably a bit restricted in terms of the structure of the data you can put in. So if you wanted to put your example there, Louise, is an actual config class, an actual class. Yeah. So chucking a class into XML is possible, but you wouldn't be able to do that with INI. And even with a simpler example like an array, you can do. I've done arrays before, but like if you've got a cluster, I guess if you've got a cluster of data within your INI, I guess that would still work, because you can convert that like you would for the whole thing. But I think that example is quite a good one where you would be able to do that with an INI, I don't think. Okay, so Kabal's talking about SQLite. If people come across SQLite, yeah, it's like the file-based database thing that James Powell's done. There's a toolkit. If you have time to have a look for that. SQLite database configuration settings history of change. Nice, yeah, nice. Okay, so the next one is like I say, related to that validation piece, but whether you sort of populate a type def once you read in your data or not. So we all know type defs are really great for maintaining that consistency of data through your application. They're brilliant for that, but they also have the ability to support your validation approach. So what I've shown, like the two functions where you can convert your data into a type def for XML and JSON. You've got that exact same thing for INI as well through the OpenG toolkit, which I'll show later on. So the way that works, for those that don't know, you effectively have a function, you wire in your data from your file as a string, and then you also wire up a type def constant that represents the data that will come out the other end. And obviously when you run it, it converts the data into that type def. So that's great if everything matches. So if your type def has got all the data, all the parameters that are in your file, brilliant, it all works, lovely jubbly. But if you have any mismatch, then you don't get an error. It will just not populate that field, or you obviously won't get it if you've got a field in your file that you haven't got in your type def. So one of the ways to manage that is to use default values. So in your type def constant, you can put default values in and then check for if those default values exist when you've gone through the process of converting it to the type def, because in that way you'll know that it hasn't been populated. So that works really well. I'll just jump on to the next slide. So that works really well for numbers, like you can use NaN for sort of double precision numbers. For integers, you can just use a number that's outside of the range. So that'll be easy for you to do the check. But for Boolean, like a false and a true is a genuine value, right? So if you could have a true value in there, you could have a false value, both of those are valid. You can't really check Boolean against a default, is basically what I'm saying. So one of the ways that you can handle that is you can have something that's called like a comparison flag, or companion flag, sorry. So basically you have to do a little bit of extra validation, and you need to actually check your data, your file data, to see whether that file exists, and then you set that companion flag to true if it does exist, and then that kind of completes your sort of validation of a Boolean field. So it's quite a unique Boolean in that way that both values of it can be valid. So taking that approach, that was one of the things I learned from doing this, actually, because I'm totally honest, we don't really do validation, to be honest, and it's definitely something that I need to start doing more, because it's not ideal to be not validating stuff. So it's a good practice that I need to get into the habit of doing. But has anybody kind of come across any challenges around sort of validation or good approaches to validation? Yeah.
And same as binary flag.
Yeah.
So when you read back, if the variant doesn't match with the type def, it will sort of.
Okay. So it's a bit like the CRC approach, is it? Is that right? So yeah, you've got to buy. Yeah.
What exactly?
Nice. Yeah, I like that. So that's kind of saves you checking each individual default value, I guess, then, doesn't it? So would that work if, just trying to think, like, what would you check it against? Do you know what I mean? Like, because if you've got your data in your file that's converted to a type def, what type def would you compare the binary conversion to?
You need to version.
Okay.
So that version is on that.
Yeah.
So when you read back, it has to match that version. So if it doesn't, then it will just so the variant, when you try to convert it to variant and convert it back. So if the type doesn't match or the content doesn't match, the variant will fall.
Okay, cool.
So we can
I'll have a look at that. Yeah, I'll have a look at that. Sounds good. Sounds good. Anyone else? Good. Let's check the chat. Cool. Yes, that's a bit of a list of all the sort of defaults, and whether the default would be a problem, and then what the workaround might be. So I think I mentioned versioning here, but didn't really cover it. So going to cover it here. Again, versioning is something I haven't really done in terms of the way that I think of versioning is that you would have a parameter inside your text file that would be your version number, and then somewhere in your code you'd hard code the version of the config that is compatible with that source code, and then you do a check at the start and say this is the wrong version, you're not allowed to use it. So that's kind of my understanding of how I would implement versioning on a configuration file. And I think that's an all right way. I don't know if anybody else has done versioning before and it's got a good way of doing that. But some of the sort of principles to think about when including this is that you want to make sure the numbers you're using are nice and simple. You don't have to go down to the lengths that you would with software where you've got your 1.1.1.1. You don't need to go to that level with it. Obviously, with all this kind of stuff, with change management, making sure that documentation is there to track what changes there are between the different versions. And then you've got to make sure that it's separate to your version of your software, because as it says there, you might have a version of the config that works with a number of the different versions of the software. So yeah, some sort of good principles that I thought would be useful to follow for versioning of config files. Yeah, so anyone doing this type of stuff? Got any good thoughts on it? No. Do we all do versioning? Yeah. And how do you do it? Do you do it with, you got that location, I guess, so.
It depends on each of always sounds like O1A.
Version in like the file name. Yeah. Nice.
We do have matching version of the config file to the code file, I mean, in all cases, which has some limitations, but it keeps it very clear and simple.
You kind of know what's going on as well, and you've got that clear.
Each deployment's got its own version.
Yeah.
So we're not maintaining what you just mentioned, but having the capability to use multiple copies of one file, we just kept it very simple.
Yeah.
Kind of a bit more fail safe.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay, so we on to next. Yeah, so the next design decision, probably a relatively important one, is whether you go for a single file or whether you break your config files up. And again, I think it's probably application specific, this decision. But with a single file, you've obviously got some benefits in that you've got easier version control if you're doing it in one file rather than trying to version multiple files. Downsides, if you've got a massive file, then it becomes maybe a bit challenging to read. But I'm not sure that's actually a thing. I can't think of a good example of that situation. Modular or breaking your configs up probably fits quite nicely with plugin architectures, but also if you're developing reusable modules, I guess you would want to have a configuration file per module, so that if you're reusing that across multiple applications, then you wouldn't want to have to then integrate the configuration file for that module that you're reusing. You probably want to just keep it isolated to that particular module. So yeah, I think this is probably an easier decision. And in my experience, I can only think of one in recent times where we've had more than one configuration file. And that was quite a nice case in that we had a rig config file. So obviously everything to do with the rig was in there. And then we had a product or unit under test config file. And obviously you had all your configuration file and stuff for that. And that was quite a nice separation, quite clean. And it sort of made sense. So other than that, I haven't had any, can't think of any anyway, where we've had to split configurations up. Okay, so handling kind of multiple environments. So what I mean by this is that so I've quite familiar with the approach that you would have a set of configuration files for production, for development, and for like your CI. So we had an application we were managing for an assembly line. So for that application, we had that process set up. So when we were running our CI, that had a set of configuration files that maybe had slightly different sort of addresses for connecting to things that it was using. So a number of different things that you could then change that were relevant to that execution of the pipeline. And then obviously within your dev environment, you're maybe on a local environment, so you're connecting to something that's within your environment, so you need that to change. So we kind of set it up so that you didn't have to kind of change your code to be able to, you just had to change which configuration files you were using to be able to get yourself working. But there's one thing I wasn't familiar with that I learned through this, which is the idea of config merging. I quite like the idea. I'm not sure how it works in practice. I don't know if you guys have used this approach, then it'd be good to kind of understand how you've found it. So the idea is that you have a default config, and that gets loaded no matter what. And then depending on what you're doing, and you would obviously set this up by somehow reading particular files. So in this example, we've got default dev user. So it would load the default file, and then it might override. Let's jump onto the next parameter because it shows it quite nicely. Then you might override, the default might override some parameters that are relative to your dev environment. And then the next layer would override to set up override some parameters for the user. So I'm thinking like this would be a case maybe where you were developing the code and you wanted to see what it looked like when you were running it as a user, you might run through those 3 stages. And there's an element of me that's thinking this is quite complicated, it feels a bit overkill, but at the same time I'm thinking it sounds quite neat to be able to just do that rather than do those things I've just described, but in a different way, which would potentially mean sort of code changing or switching the code you're using or something like that. So I don't know, anybody use that sort of principle of merging? Yeah.
On certain thing like programming, for instance, we on one of the products, one of the lines have got a common programming sequence.
Yeah.
Which has its own config.
Yeah.
Then how you've got the rig set up to work to one of the other 6 units. It says, oh, on unit A, so then it'll go the code sits, looks at the config of the rig.
Yeah.
And then it says, okay, I've got to go grab this config file as well.
Yeah.
Then
using those 2 things to execute. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that.
Those you've got you don't ever have to change the programming sequence.
Yes.
You just change the sort of programming.
Yeah. External to your code, right? Yeah. So that's like it's coming back to that splitting your configs. That wasn't a choice that you've made, right? That's been forced upon you just through the design of the system.
Yeah, we chose to do that.
Okay.
To make it easier.
Just to isolate.
Yeah, we only got one lot of validation for the code.
Yeah.
And we just got the config file.
Yeah. Anybody else used merging before? Yeah. Double check the chat. Still the same. So yeah, some of the benefits which I didn't really touch on, but obviously it gives you a bit of flexibility without changing code, which potentially one way you do it, you'd go into your config file and you change the parameters. So perhaps instead of doing that, you would sequentially load those configs to sort of save you having to go into your config file. But I guess you've got to sort of balance the effort to get that structure set up to enable merging versus just going into a file and changing stuff. So I guess that's, again, it's kind of an application based decision that you would make as to whether you go down that route or not. The one that I really liked actually was the ability to sort of roll back. So loading the default is like a safe set of config or config setup. So if you then came to the next layer of override in your dev environment and it failed for whatever reason, you could sort of just roll back to your default and still open the application under default configuration. Now, again, that's probably an application specific thing. Like, would that work in the kind of requirements within your application? It would have to be made up, but that decision would have to be made at that time. So, but I quite like the idea of that idea that you can sort of have a problem with something and fall back onto something that's sort of safe. And I guess if your default's corrupt, then you're screwed anyway. But yeah, that was quite a nice one. Easier debugging. So potentially, and this may not necessarily be related to merging, but you might just have like a debug config that's got certain things set up so that you can just load that config when you're going to be doing some debugging. And I can't sort of think in my head like what parameters you would have in there that are massively different to what your normal config file. So again, I haven't got any experience that kind of I can relate to on these, but it just in principle sounds like some good ideas that might be valuable to consider when you're designing these things.
Thanks for logging.
Yeah. So sort of frequency and what. Yeah.
Debugging.
Yeah.
And same with the release. We might have optimizations enabled for that.
Yeah. Nice. So again, just a few sort of best practices that I came across through doing the research on this. You'd obviously need to make sure you know when you've got your merged file, you need to know where all the different parameters have come from, whether it was from the default or from dev or from user or whatever sort of config file it came from. You need to set up a really clear structure for storing these files, because it could potentially get quite messy if you're just dropping them all in one folder and just a bit of a free fall. That might become a bit messy and not really easy to understand. And then the last one on there would be that you would have to make sure you save the final version of the config so that you've got that for debugging later on if you needed it.
Also have to
Okay.
You've got like a base level security, which anyone can see. You then go up different security levels.
Okay. Yeah.
By having it segregated.
Yeah.
Helps a lot.
Yeah. Nice. So what you're saying there is that you'd have a different set of configuration parameters depending on which security level you're at.
Yeah, or yeah, what you're shipping at the end, what level of security that is
Yeah.
used at.
Okay. Yeah. Nice. So yeah, the last kind of design decision is about encryption. So there's definitely some obvious use cases for encryption listed on there. But basically what you're looking to try and do is hide IP or hide some sensitive data from sort of the human eye just reading it, is the principle. I think it's quite important that this is a really important one where you've got to make that decision based on like, does this really need encrypting? Because there's obviously some overhead around that in terms of encrypting, decrypting, all those things take a bit more time. So you need to make sure you're considering that. If you're trying to encrypt a massive file and then having to decrypt that in your application, then you might come up against problems and performance. So yeah, it's probably a decision around those kind of elements. But I guess what this doesn't mean is that you've got a secure application because you've encrypted something. It's probably more obfuscation than it is security in some cases, because ultimately if you can decrypt it in your LabVIEW application, then it's more than likely somebody else can do that if they really want to. So just wanted to cover a couple of the sort of different types of options that are available. You obviously got the basics, which you can implement sort of the basics before encoding, those sorts of things. Then the next level up is sort of the advanced encryption standard. And there's some really nice third-party libraries for this. We've used this on an application recently and it's dead easy. It's slightly higher protection than the basic stuff, but the one thing you've got to remember with this is that you need a key to be able to do the decryption. So that has to be hard-coded into your LabVIEW. But ultimately, that's not necessarily a con. I don't think you can't do it without that. So it's just part of using that, making that decision to use that is one of the things that's one of the things that comes along with it. And then the last one, you can, I didn't know this, you can use Windows Credential Manager, and there's actually this geezer, Rolf Calvimatter, has got the IBM package that implements this. So ultimately, Windows Credential Manager is like basically somewhere in Windows where you can store credentials. And then within LabVIEW, you can go to that store to pull out the credentials to log into an application in essence. So I think that was quite a neat way of doing things. I don't know how hard that is to get to the point where it's usable and sort of what it looks like, but it sounded like quite a neat way of sort of implementing that type of stuff. So yeah, something that maybe to consider when you're going through this part of the design. Yeah, so I think that was everything in terms of the content. Now I'm going to not expose myself. That doesn't sound right at all. I'm going to just show you a bit of code is what I meant. So I'm just going to stop sharing for those guys online. I'm just going to share my whole screen. So this the code I'm going to show you is kind of along the lines of the last point at the very start, which was about trying to work out whether we could implement a reusable library. So basically what I did was I created a configuration module, and this is nowhere near complete. So yeah, easy on the judgment. So what we've got is this is effectively the I'm not sharing with anybody, sorry. This is effectively like the module that would run within your application, and effectively what it would do is bear with me. So in here, what it would do is read the configuration file, and I'll just walk through this bit. So the principle that I've kind of based this on is that we've got in here, this is effectively the configuration structure. So it's based on INI, so I've got sections and keys. And in essence, what I'm saying is that I'm defining the structure of the file in LabVIEW. So when you come to this for the first time, you're going to need to run, there's a create function that would create the file with these sections and keys. So the additional information that you've got against it is default values and what type of data it is. And then this structure is then used to read the file in. So obviously one of the downsides to this is if you change the structure, you'd have to come in here, change this structure, then recreate the file, which would definitely, at the moment anyway, overwrite the data that's in that file. But I think that's something that could be quite easily overcome if I chose to go take this any further. So that's the principle of sort of how the structure of the file is managed, and also the file is created. And then I love OpenG, by the way. Is anyone else using OpenG? Should be using OpenG, right? It's mega. Loads of really cool functions. So what this one does is just gets unique value. So I basically pull out all of the sections, and then get all the unique sections to loop through. That's what I'm looping through in each iteration. So in essence, what I'm doing is looping through each section and then finding all the keys for the section, I think, or finding all the data in this structure that are in that section, and then looping through that and creating a variant dictionary for that section, and then adding it to a bigger variant dictionary for the so this will basically contain a key value pair, so the key in the config file with the value of the key, and then this will contain the keys for the section. And I'm doing it all in a variant library thing. No, like variable. I call it a variable dictionary. I don't know if that's what it's called, but that's what I call it. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I didn't want to couple this to a type def, because the idea would be that this would be the whole system configuration. So you might have config parameters for different parts of the system. So I didn't want to couple the configuration file to the other modules in the system. And that was the idea behind that. So I don't know whether that makes any sense, or anybody's got any thoughts or comments. I'm happy to just pick it apart. I'm happy for you to abuse me in a way. Or is it a load of nonsense? So that's effectively how the data gets into the configuration module. Then that's chucked onto a shift register. And then basically every module within the application would send a message to this configuration module and say, kind of give me my config. So one of the key things I perhaps missed out is that the section is effectively the module name in essence. So those two things are tied together. So if I've got, in this case, I think this is, yeah, digital output DAC. So if I've got some configuration parameters for digital output DAC, I'll receive a message from digital output DAC, and it'll then grab the bits out of the dictionary related to that, and then send it back to the digital output DAC module, and then it converts it to into a type def. So then I've got an example of, I think, yeah. So then this is just an example of a module. So a module would have this, where it basically converts your variant into, I was just thinking that I could maybe do that in a better way. But yeah, what this is doing is, I think I can do this in a better way actually. But anyway, what this is doing is it's pulling out each, I'm pointing at my screen. So this will be the section's key and value pairs. And then we're basically using a key to get the value out. So these will be all the keys within the INI file. And then it basically puts it into the relevant field within the configuration type def. Then you've got a type def for that particular module that represents the configuration for that module. Yeah, so that's my idea. But I don't know, anyone got any thoughts, comments, questions, things that need to be explained? That'll be that easy to read on
Your devices pre-config in their initialization.
there. Yeah,
There's different ones at startup.
yeah, and then shift register with the type def for that module. Another thing I'm always wary of, and I don't know whether I need to be wary of it, is like having lots of data like that in memory, and whether that's going to cause a problem. And I think it's of the scale that, like, yeah. So unless you're talking like big,
If you set it all at the startup, you keep reading from the file if you have time.
this is what I was, yeah, this is that's kind of the debate I think I was thinking about, was do you just read it from the file each time?
I read it all in memory.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
You've got issue where it has significant test time increases by constantly reading
From the file or from, yeah.
Like you think it doesn't take much time, but when you do it,
Yeah, and there's other stuff going on as well, right?
Yeah.
Not just that.
yeah,
Yeah.
it all adds up. You think, oh, it adds up to an extra 20 minutes of test time.
Yeah,
And you're doing multiple of those a day.
yeah, yes. The numbers start to get big then. Yeah, yeah. I think it's better to think on the cautious side than it is to not worry about it. Is my kind of the way I think about it.
I don't know what the size of config files for the people typically working with, but what we're working with, the memory is pretty cheap.
Yeah, yeah,
These days.
yeah. No, no. Yeah.
I think in our Mac it's quite a big file as well, isn't it? When you use Macs to set up that device and store a file.
Okay. So what would that would include, like module name, range, signal range,
Yeah.
acquisition.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there's an overlap there, but you might be able to. I don't know. Some use Macs that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess if you create a task that had a load of DAC in it, you might be able to get the configuration out of that, I guess.
Yeah.
But I've never used it like that before. Yeah, yeah. What do you think of the idea of like creating the file from within LabVIEW? Like, is that a bit stupid, or is that not stupid, no stupider than anything else, or is it like, I don't know?
The way I've done this in the past, probably quite old fashioned. Depends how many things you've got to configure, but I normally have a tab for my configuration details, and sometimes it's two. So one's for the test rig setup, and one's for the product setup.
Yeah.
Like you said. But in the test rig setup, I would often give the option to load or save that file and still use the ini file. It's just where you've got your VI that has read, you'd have a write.
Yeah.
In there, the write, perhaps a write to function. So you'd have to configure it, GUI, to do it. But the advantage is that you could find a configuration that works. Somebody's moved to USB port. That used to be a write pane, sometimes depending on what visa name came up and so on. How you connected to it, whether it's COM or whatever. So I'd let them configure that and then save it locally.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's sort of almost not every time you do that, but if you want a new machine, you set up through that approach.
Yeah. But we never even had to do it that often. But
I was thinking about this. Yeah. Yeah.
They want to upgrade PCs running Windows 10 and it's end of life this year, and then it just needs to be set up again. New drivers and new COM ports potentially. Yeah,
because one of the things I was thinking about when I was putting this together was like, well, how often do you actually, like, once you've finished commissioning something and it's in production or it's working, like, how often do you actually change the configuration of that? How often do you use those configuration parameters or change them? I guess it depends on the environment you're in. Right, but
more, I think for the answer is more than you'd ever expect. Yeah. costs and effort of training
Yeah.
in production. I think it all understand.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you find? Go on.
Enablement equipment where different naming templates, that's essentially configuration data, and you use one to change that all the time.
Yeah. Did you find that your configurations are expanding in terms of what's configurable, or is it just that they're changing the same set of configuration parameters?
It's expanding lots of ways to just actually inoculate lots of confusion.
Uh-huh.
You know, this is what's really happening. So we're creating, supporting a new build standard. We still have to support the old build standard. Although we still get this proliferation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we're trying to control the proliferation by using like a plugin architecture,
Uh-huh.
but reduce the number of different parameters that we need to do with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it has proliferation of different types of configuration.
Yeah. Yeah. A different type of proliferation. Yeah.
Usually, when you're running from Windows, you're running a LabVIEW runtime application from Windows environment. You have that a lot of risk because every 5 years, new Windows version,
Yeah.
and someone the barcode reader breaks and they're plugging a different one.
Yeah, and that's obviously that one's obsolete, so it's a different barcode scanner. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess if you've got hardware and one or something running independently, then maybe don't need as much once it's in production.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's one thing I didn't say at the start, which was like when I was thinking about developing that application from scratch, my principle was like, I don't want to. Feels like you shouldn't have to spend loads of time on configuration because I don't know, it just doesn't feel like the main part of the application. Right, it should be something that's quite quick, and that's what led me to like think about reusability. But it should be easy, it should be quick, and it should be simple. But ultimately, I'm not sure that's actually the truth. But it's
I think actually the more time you spend up front thinking about it, the easier it is and the simpler it becomes. If you don't think about it, it's not really difficult, X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
That's really normally you just go boom and shit.
Yeah, because later on you're like,
I should have done that. I mean, it did think of this, we didn't think of that. It's
Yeah.
that planning stage where
and that's a general. Yeah.
Just hard code.
Yeah.
What this topic is on major architectural decisions.
Yeah.
Once taken that decision and started moving with it, in some ways it's not stuck with it forever, but it's a big effort to change.
Yeah. And there's always pressure to do things quickly, like that you don't necessarily get the time sometimes to consider these things as much as you'd want to. But yeah,
It's area to re-architecting. That once it's all set up, then you can turn out to a new application by following the same path.
Yeah.
It's sometimes being hit constantly with the consequences.
Yeah. Sure, there's nothing in the chat. Okay. Time is 4 o'clock. So we're pretty close to finishing up anyway. So any other questions before we wrap up?
When you have a really big configuration variable, a lot of variables, how do you move all the data through the program? Do you put everything in a
The type def?
in a top definition?
Yeah.
Or do you module? You look at right there.
it depends on how you're going to use it.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you've got lots and lots of different test equipment, what you're going to be using to do that test or to form test that unit, Ideally, if you split up to that per instrument, it's a lot easier to use.
But sometimes we make one variable inside
Yeah,
from another.
yeah, and that's the thing. It depends what your end use is for that configuration data. You know, that's the thing. It's purely dependent on your system. The best way to do it. There's no hard and fast rule on how to do it. Sometimes having one massive list of configuration data might be really easy for you to use. For most circumstances, especially from our point of view, it's all in blocks. Then you just call that block. So it's all there. That's that individual block of data for that test or for that unit or that set of individual tests you're doing there and there.
Yeah, but I think in terms of your question about how you pass it around, I think the best way that I've found is to put it into a type def cluster and you use that approach as opposed to like what we talked about in terms of opening the file all the time.
Yeah, that's slow.
Yeah, that's slow and
Slow
can cause you
things
problems. Yeah, that's what your colleague was just saying. And so I think, definitely getting it into memory in a type def cluster is the way. Like how you split it up is probably the challenge, and that's the design I think that you need to spend time thinking about, because you thought you said like if you need parameter in two places, like is there an issue with decoupling, like you've sort of maybe moved something in the wrong place? Is that a step back and looking at something else as opposed to
Sometimes the race conditions. So
Yeah.
You're going to rate in one place and
Yeah.
in another.
Yeah.
That's really planning comes in, planning beforehand.
Yeah.
You can end up causing yourself lots and lots of issues.
Yeah, sometimes it's like at the end they actually, oh, could you please do this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Add the functional.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else? All good. All right. Well, I really appreciate your input, guys, because that was really valuable for me and hopefully for you guys too. But yeah, that kind of wraps up my talk. So thanks very much for listening. So yeah, next time around we're going to be down in Oxford, so a little bit further away from where we are now, but probably in about 4 months' time. Obviously there'll be remote connections to connect up to that. If anybody isn't on like the mailing list, we have a mailing list to send stuff out to. Drop me a message. I don't know, LinkedIn, or I don't know how I can scribble my email address down, go real old school, but just send me an email that you're happy for me to put on that mailing list so that you get the information about them. And yeah, like I say, over the next few months we'll be securing speakers and all that kind of stuff. And if you guys want to speak, like it's a nice friendly bunch of people to be in front of, so if you guys want a bit of experience speaking, then please put your hand up and offer up a topic, and we're more than welcome to come along. So yeah, thanks again for coming along. Hope you enjoyed the pizza. Thank you, NI. If they're listeners, nobody here from NI, but we'll say thank you, NI, for pizza, and we'll see you guys next time.